Before I had a RV, I owned several boats, and I also did boat projects. Boat-project.com is my boat project website, and it is a sister to the rv-project.com website. Unfortunately, this era was before I produced YouTube videos, so there are no videos for these boat projects. While most projects are boat-oriented, a few of those projects do have some application for RVs, and I do have the original photos and project narrative, so I will be re-releasing some of those projects for rv-project.com as videos. In this first project, I will show how I constructed a set of fiberglass speaker balls. In addition to the speaker enclosures, the construction techniques can be used for almost any shape imaginable. This could be an alternative method for 3D printed parts if you do not have a 3D printer. The technique is called one-off, where the fiberglass covers a pattern for a one-time part. The pattern itself is destroyed during the molding process. This is in contrast to the traditional plug mold part casting process used for fiberglass parts. I prefer to use epoxy resin as it is easier to work with and will not attack the styrofoam I will be using in the speaker ball project. To create the molds, I purchased two 8-inch styrofoam balls at my local craft store, then cut off one end so that I had a flat spot to mount the speakers. I then used a Stanley Sureform tool to slightly modify the ball shape. While I'm constructing speaker balls in this project, you can glue up various styrofoam shapes for almost any shape imaginable. I used Polk DB650 6.5-inch speakers for the project as well. When I had the styrofoam balls shaped the way I liked them, I used 2-inch wide fiberglass cloth strips to cover the balls. Although fiberglass mat could be used, the complexity of the part and the need to go around corners will dictate what kind of fiberglass you will be using. To get the fiberglass to stick to the styrofoam balls, I used 3M 77 spray adhesive. I simply sprayed the adhesive on the fiberglass strips and applied them to the speaker balls. I did have some concern about the adhesive filling between the strands of fiberglass, which could weaken the part, but I did not seem to have this issue. Still, I used the adhesive as sparingly as possible when I attached the strips. After completely wrapping the balls with fiberglass cloth, I then used West System 105 epoxy resin and 205 epoxy hardener, and using a foam brush I applied the epoxy to the entire surface. Do not use polyester resin, which is common in boat stores. It will eat the styrofoam and the foam brushes. When the epoxy is almost cured but still has a bit of stickiness to it, I applied a second coat of fiberglass cloth and epoxy. 2 layers should be considered minimum, and a third layer would not hurt. If you let the epoxy fully cure and dry to the touch, a waxy substance called amine blush can form. This will prevent the next layer of epoxy from properly adhering. If this happens, simply use a bit of sandpaper and roughen up the first layer so that it is no longer shiny. Applying each layer to the previous layer while it's still a bit tacky prevents this. While the last coat is curing, use a propane torch and very lightly, and I mean very lightly, heat the ball with a torch, making sure you do not melt the styrofoam underneath. This step will pop any bubbles that might be forming on the surface, as bubbles will be hard to fix. After letting the fiberglass cure for at least 24 hours, you will want to rough sand the surface to remove any amine blush and to smooth out any imperfections. You do not have to go overboard with sanding at this point. Just knock off any really rough spots and try to get it somewhat smooth. Then, make 2 batches of epoxy. Leave one batch as is, but add West System 410 sanding and fairing filler to the other batch. Simply add the filler into the mixed batch of epoxy until the epoxy has the consistency of peanut butter. At that point, you have added the proper amount of filler. Apply a thin coat of the epoxy without the filler to each ball. This will wet the surface of the ball so that the epoxy with the filler will adhere. Then apply the epoxy with the filler to the balls. If the consistency is right, you may have some sagging and dripping, but the filler should pretty much stay put. Again, lightly hit the surface with a propane torch to pop any bubbles on the surface. After the filler has completely cured, sand the ball smooth, again knocking the high spots down, but not sanding into the fiberglass cloth. This is the most arduous part of the project and may require several coats of filler to get a perfect surface. You may use a paint primer after the last filler coat to help determine if there are any remaining imperfections. You may actually have a few remaining bubbles on the surface, so you may have to spot fill these as you find them. And sanding can uncover more bubbles, so it does take some patience. The better job you do with a torch, the fewer bubbles you will have, and you might even completely eliminate them. Now comes the fun part. When you are satisfied with the exterior surface of the balls, the styrofoam must be removed from the inside. Begin by gouging out the center of the styrofoam to form a pocket. Then, in a well-ventilated area, preferably outdoors, pour lacquer thinner directly into the styrofoam pocket. The lacquer thinner will rapidly eat the styrofoam away, turning it into a goo. Pour the goo out and you will remove most of the goo from the inside. Of course, safely dispose of any of the styrofoam goo that poured out of the balls. There will likely be some residual styrofoam goo left on the inside of the balls after you do this, but it will harden and won't hurt anything. If you use 2 layers of fiberglass cloth, you should have a fiberglass ball about 1/8 inch thick. Using a Dremel tool, enlarge the ball opening to the proper size for the speaker, then cut out a wood backing ring and mounting pad out of a hardwood such as maple, and epoxy them to the inside. If you cut the ring as shown, it will slip into the inside by using a technique similar to putting a key on a split ring keychain. Hardwood or thin plywood is preferred as it provides a better foundation to hold the speaker's mounting screws than other softwoods could. When gluing the parts to the ball, I used West System 403 gap-filling adhesive filler added to the epoxy mixture, again mixed to a peanut butter consistency. Since the inside of the ball will be rough due to the styrofoam's texture, the filler will help create a good bond with the speaker backing ring. Clamp it until it's cured. The finishing steps include priming then painting the balls with your favorite enamel, mounting the speakers, attaching a mount, and then wiring the balls. I used a ram mount system swing arm, part number 109H. While this project makes a pair of speaker balls, the fiberglass over styrofoam technique can be used for many shapes for things used on your RV. 3D printed projects such as the hitch ball camera enclosure I did a couple years ago would work with this technique.